You cast right into the perfect spot. You know the fish are there, but absolutely nothing happens. You drag your bait, you pop it, you wait. Still nothing. What if I told you that your absolute favorite spring jig, the one you trust more than any other lure in your tackle box, is completely invisible to the fish right now? It sounds insane, I know. You hold it in your hand and it looks perfectly natural. But under the water, hidden deep in those thick spring weeds, it is a completely different story. Today we are going to expose a massive blind spot in how we approach heavy cover. I'm going to show you the unexpected truth about why so many fishermen go home empty-handed during the spring rush. Get ready, because what we are about to discuss might just break everything your grandpa taught you about jig fishing. I have to ask you right now, are you brave enough to admit that your go-to method might be totally wrong? Let me know in the comments. Spring is the time when the big ones push shallow and bury themselves in the newly emerging vegetation. This is the prime time we all dream about all winter long. Because of this, fishing in the weeds is a skill every angler tries to master. For decades, the older generation has hammered a few golden rules into our heads. They told us to tie on a heavy, dark-colored jig, punch it through the canopy, and wait for that heavy thump on the line. We have built our entire spring strategy around these old habits. We do the exact same thing year after year, buying the exact same lures, making the exact same casts. But here is the problem with doing the same thing for 20 years. The fish adapt, the environments change, and frankly, some of those old-school rules were based on guesswork, not underwater reality. We throw these baits believing they are putting on a show for the fish. But the environment down in those dense weeds is playing tricks on us and hiding our baits in ways we never even considered. Picture this for a second. It is a beautiful spring morning on your favorite lake. The mist is still rolling off the water, the air is crisp, and you have that nervous excitement in your stomach. You reach into your tackle box and pull out that one jig. You know the exact one, the same jig you have been tying on for the last 10 years, because an old-timer swore by it. You cast it right into the heart of a massive patch of new spring weeds. The bait hits the surface, but out there on the lake there is just silence. You wait patiently. You twitch the rod tip. Nothing. You pull it back, and there is just a clump of green slime on your hook. You tell yourself that the fish are just not biting today, or maybe a cold front pushed them out to deeper water. But what if you are completely wrong? What if the fish are sitting right there, staring straight ahead, and your favorite lure is literally invisible to them? It sounds crazy, right? But the truth is, most of us are casting blind into a jungle. We trust the old ways so much that we refuse to see what is actually happening under the surface. When you understand how a jig behaves in thick cover, you will realize that you have been wasting hours of your life hoping for a lucky accident. Let us dive under the surface and look at the real situation. Imagine you are a big predator sitting in a dense patch of spring vegetation. This is not a crystal clear swimming pool. It is a thick, dark, and tangled jungle of green stems and brown decay from the previous year. The sunlight is trying to push through the canopy, but it only creates harsh, blinding beams of light, mixed with pitch-black shadows. When you throw your standard dark-colored jig into this chaotic mess, it does not stand out like a beacon of hope. It sinks into the shadows and completely disappears. We have been taught for generations that dark colors work best in heavy cover because they create a solid silhouette. But here is the brutal truth that nobody talks about on the docks. If your jig falls into a pocket of absolute darkness at the base of those weeds, a dark silhouette simply does not exist. It just becomes part of the void. You could hop that lure right across the nose of a giant fish, and she would not even blink. She literally cannot see it. We spend hundreds of dollars on highly detailed, custom-painted jigs, only to throw them into a black hole, where all that expensive paint means absolutely nothing. Now let us talk about the heavyweight problem. Everyone tells you to use a 3/4 ounce or even a full 1 ounce jig to punch through the spring canopy. It makes sense on paper. You need the weight to break through the thick mat on the surface. But think about what happens after it breaks through. That heavy chunk of lead plummets to the bottom like a rock. The bottom of these weed beds is rarely hard gravel in the early spring. It is usually a soft, thick layer of muck and decaying leaves from the autumn before. Your heavy jig crashes into that soft bottom and buries itself entirely. The weed guard, the skirt, the trailer, everything vanishes into the mud. You are standing on the deck of your boat, slowly hopping your rod tip, imagining your jig dancing beautifully. Meanwhile, down in the dark, you are just dragging a clump of buried mud. The fish are suspended a foot or two off the bottom, looking around the weed stalks. They are waiting for something to swim by. They are not digging in the dirt. Your lure is completely out of their line of sight, hidden in the sludge. Let us move on to the vibration factor, which is arguably more important than sight in the weeds. Fish do not just use their eyes to hunt in a jungle. They rely heavily on their lateral lines to feel movement in the water. This is how they hunt at night or in muddy water. So, you pitch your standard, sleek flipping jig into a hole in the grass. It slides down quietly. That is great for not getting snagged, but it is terrible for getting noticed. A sleek jig does not displace enough water on the fall. It does not push a pressure wave. To a fish sitting 2 feet away, behind a wall of green stalks, that bait does not even exist. If it does not move water, it does not send a signal. We often choose jigs with thin skirts and streamlined heads to slip through the cover effortlessly. But in doing so, we rob the bait of its presence. You are basically sneaking past the fish without saying hello. If they cannot see it because of the shadows, and they cannot feel it because it is too sleek, you are effectively fishing with a ghost. And you cannot catch fish with a ghost. There is a massive misconception about the profile of your bait. We often hear that early spring means you should use small, compact baits because the local forage is small. Fishermen will downsize to tiny bitsy jigs, thinking they are matching the hatch perfectly. But in dense cover, a tiny profile is your worst enemy. Drop a tiny jig into a forest of thick coontail or milfoil, and it gets swallowed by the environment instantly. The stalks are wider than your bait. The leaves completely cover it up. When a fish is looking through a maze of vegetation, they need something substantial to catch their eye. A larger, bulkier profile creates a bigger visual footprint. Even if they only see a fraction of it passing behind a weed stalk, a bulky jig gives them enough information to strike. By sticking to the old rule of downsizing in the spring, you are making it incredibly difficult for the fish to locate your offering. You are asking them to find a needle in a haystack, in the dark. Sometimes you need to throw a massive, obnoxious profile just to break through the visual clutter of the underwater jungle. Contrast is a concept that very few fishermen truly understand when fishing the grass. We spend hours trying to match the exact shade of a green pumpkin crawfish. We hold our baits up to the sunlight and admire the subtle metallic flakes in the plastic. But down in the weeds, everything is a shade of green, brown, or black. When you throw a natural green jig into a dense forest of green weeds, you are applying perfect camouflage. You are literally hiding your hook from the fish. Contrast is king in heavy cover. The fish are often looking up towards the surface or horizontally through the stalks. If your bait blends in with the background, it is invisible. This is where we need to break the traditional rules. You need a color that fights against the background. A pop of orange, a streak of bright blue, or even a solid white belly can make all the difference. It sounds unnatural, but a fish reacts to things that stand out. If you refuse to use high-contrast colors because they do not look like a real crawfish to your human eyes, you are sabotaging your own success on the water. Let us talk about the plastic trailer you stick on the back of your jig. I see guys doing this all the time on the lake. They pull out a stiff, lifeless plastic craw, thread it on the hook, and think they are ready for battle. In open water, where you can hop and swim the bait aggressively, that stiff trailer might work. But in the thick spring weeds, most of your strikes happen on the initial fall. As that bait is dropping through the canopy, you need the trailer to be doing the work. A stiff plastic does nothing. It just drags behind the lead head like a dead weight. The fish only have a split-second window to see the bait as it falls past their face. If there are no kicking legs, no flapping claws, and no vibration, the bait fails to grab their attention. They might see a blur go by, but it does not look alive. It just looks like a falling stick. You must choose trailers with soft, highly active appendages that flutter violently even on a slow vertical drop. If your trailer is dead on the fall, your jig is invisible in the one moment it needs to be seen the most. There is a massive trap that many of us fall into, and that is the scent delusion. We have all done it. You spray your jig with a heavy coat of garlic scent, or you rub some special crawfish jelly all over the skirt. You tell yourself that even if the fish cannot see it in the thick grass, they will definitely smell it and track it down. This is a comforting lie we tell ourselves. While scent can make a fish hold onto a bait longer once they bite it, it is rarely the primary way they locate a fast-falling jig in heavy cover. A predator fish is reactionary. They rely on sight and lateral line vibration first. If your jig drops straight past them in a fraction of a second, the scent trail is left lingering in the water long after the bait has buried itself in the bottom mud. The fish might smell the garlic, but they cannot find the source because the visual and vibrational cues are completely gone. Relying too much on scent while ignoring the visual profile and water displacement is a guaranteed way to go home frustrated. Stop counting on magic sprays to fix a bad presentation. The fall rate is an absolute game changer, yet it is the one thing most anglers ignore in the spring. Let us imagine you are using a heavy jig to punch through the weeds. It breaks the surface mat and then rockets towards the bottom at 100 miles an hour. It is moving so fast that it becomes a blur. Now put yourself in the position of the fish. They are nestled in the vegetation, resting, not actively chasing bait in open water. Suddenly, a dark object flies past their face and vanishes into the muck below. They do not have time to react. They do not have time to even process what just happened. A fast fall rate in dense cover means your bait is literally invisible because it does not stay in the strike zone long enough to be registered as food. You want that bait to glide down. You want it to hover and flutter as it makes its way through the stalks. By lightening your weight just enough to get through the canopy, or by adding a bulky trailer to slow the descent, you keep the bait in their line of sight for an extra 2 or 3 seconds. Those few seconds are the difference between a massive bite and hauling in empty water. Now we need to address the sound of silence. A lot of old-school fishermen swear by silent jigs in the spring. They argue that the fish are easily spooked in shallow water and a loud clanking rattle will scare them away. In clear, open water, they might be right, but we are talking about the dense, chaotic environment of spring weed beds. The stalks are rubbing together, water is moving through the vegetation, and the visibility is heavily restricted. In this environment, a silent jig is often completely lost. Adding a glass or plastic rattle to your jig strap changes everything. As you hop the bait through the stems, the sharp clicking sound acts as an acoustic beacon. It gives the fish a directional cue. They hear the click, they turn their head towards the sound, and suddenly they are looking in the right direction when your bait flashes between the leaves. Refusing to use rattles because of an old wives' tale about spooking fish is a huge mistake. In the jungle, you need to make a little noise to get noticed. Silence usually just equals invisibility. Let us examine your fishing line for a moment. Most guys fishing heavy cover spool up with 60 or 80-pound braided line. It makes perfect sense for hauling big fish out of the grass. But here is the problem. Many anglers use bright green or even yellow braid because it is easier for them to see above the water. They tie it directly to the jig. Under the water, against the natural tones of the weeds, that thick, bright braided line stands out like a neon sign. It acts as a massive warning signal to any fish in the area. Before the fish even looks down at your perfectly tied jig, they see this unnatural cable slicing through the water column above it. They are instantly put on alert. Their survival instincts kick in, and they shut down. You think your jig is doing its job, but the fish have already decided not to bite before the lure even reaches their depth. You must use a long, heavy fluorocarbon leader, or use a black marker to darken the first few feet of your braid. If your line is screaming for attention, your lure becomes completely irrelevant. There is a painful reality about the hook set in thick weeds that we need to face. Sometimes the fish actually do see your jig. Sometimes they even bite it, but you do not set the hook. Why? Because you cannot tell the difference between a fish and a weed stalk. You pitch your bait into the grass, you feel resistance, and you just pull it free, thinking you were snagged on a stem. In reality, a big fish gently sucked in your jig, and when you softly pulled it, you pulled it right out of their mouth. In dense cover, bites are rarely aggressive, rod-jerking strikes. They feel like a sponge or a sudden weightiness on the line. Because you are expecting your jig to be hidden or ignored, you doubt yourself, you hesitate. You assume it is just salad. This hesitation is the silent killer of spring fishing. You must train your brain to treat every single irregularity as a fish. If the bait feels heavy, swing hard. If the line moves a fraction of an inch to the side, set the hook. Do not assume your bait is invisible when it might actually be in the mouth of a giant. Water clarity is a massive factor that interacts violently with spring weeds. Spring is known for heavy rains and runoff, which turns the water into muddy soup. Now take that muddy water and mix it with a dense field of green vegetation. You have just created the ultimate visual blackout for a fish. The particles in the water block the light, and the weeds block whatever light is left. Anglers will still go out there and throw their subtle, natural-looking jigs, wondering why they cannot buy a bite. In these specific conditions, being subtle is a total waste of time. You need to pull out all the stops. We are talking black and blue jigs with massive thumping trailers, loud rattles, and an aggressive hopping retrieve. You have to force the fish to notice the bait through the mud and the grass. If you fish a muddy weed bed with the same finesse approach you use in clear water, your bait is quite literally invisible. You have to adapt to the blackout conditions and give the fish something impossible to ignore. Let us talk about the physical act of getting your bait into the water, the pitch and flip mechanics. I watch guys on the water all the time. They wind up and fire their heavy jig high into the air. It crashes into the water with a massive, loud splash, blowing a hole in the surface mat. They think they are being forceful and efficient, but think about the shockwave that loud entry sends through the shallow water. Every fish within a 20-foot radius feels that violent impact. They scatter instantly. By the time your jig reaches the bottom, there is not a single fish around to even look at it. You have effectively made your bait invisible by scaring away the audience before the show even starts. The true art of fishing the weeds is the silent entry. You want your jig to slide into the water like a needle, a gentle, controlled pitch that enters with barely a ripple. This keeps the fish calm and curious. They will turn to inspect the subtle displacement of water rather than fleeing in terror from a cannonball drop. There is a major controversy about using shockingly bright colors in the spring. If you look inside the tackle boxes of most traditional fishermen, you will see rows of green pumpkin, watermelon, and brown jigs. But every now and then you will meet a guy who destroys the competition, throwing a bright neon chartreuse or bubblegum pink jig into the weeds. People laugh at it. They say it looks like a toy, not a real animal. But there is a very scientific reason why it works. In the chaotic, shadow-filled environment of a weed bed, fish react to flashes of color. A bright pink jig does not look like a natural crawfish, but it absolutely demands attention. It creates a stark contrast against the green background that a predator simply cannot ignore. It triggers an aggressive reaction strike, rather than a feeding strike. While everyone else is throwing natural tones that vanish into the scenery, the angler throwing the ugly, neon bait is getting his lure seen by every fish in the area. Sometimes, breaking the rules of nature is the only way to get noticed. Matching the hatch is a phrase we hear constantly. In the spring, everyone knows bass eat crawfish, so we naturally pick jigs that look like crawfish. But here is the critical mistake. What color are the crawfish in your specific lake during the early spring? Most people assume they are always a mix of brown and green. But in many bodies of water, early spring crawfish emerging from the mud have very distinct colors. They can be dark red, almost black, or even have bright orange claws. If you are throwing a light green pumpkin jig, while the local forage is dark red, you are missing the mark. More importantly, against the backdrop of fresh green weeds, a light green jig might wash out entirely, while a dark red jig would stand out perfectly. You have to understand that matching the hatch is not just about the species, it is about the seasonal color shifts and how those colors contrast with the current environment. If you get the color wrong, your bait just blends in with the detritus on the bottom, entirely unseen. The rhythm of your retrieve is where a lot of anglers lose the game entirely. Once the jig is on the bottom, the natural instinct is to start hopping it back to the boat. Hop, drop, reel. Hop, drop, reel. It becomes a fast, mechanical rhythm. But picture the structure of a weed bed. It is not a flat field. It has pockets, holes, and tunnels. There are small visual windows where a fish has a clear line of sight. If you are hopping your jig quickly, you are likely jumping it right past these small windows. The bait flies up, clears the weeds, and drops back down before the fish can focus on it. You are literally pulling the bait out of their view. To keep your bait visible, you have to slow down. You need to gently drag the bait through the stems, letting it hang up on a leaf, and then softly shaking it free. This keeps the lure in the visual windows for a much longer period. A slow, methodical crawl gives the fish time to locate the bait, study it, and decide to eat it. Speed makes your bait a blur. Patience makes it a target. We always think of jigs as a purely vertical presentation in the grass. You drop it down, hop it up and repeat. But sometimes, the densest weeds are simply unfishable with a bottom hopping technique. The bottom is just too fouled with slime and dead grass. Your bait gets covered instantly, becoming an invisible green blob. This is where the horizontal presentation becomes a massive advantage. I am talking about a swim jig. Instead of letting the bait fall into the black hole at the bottom, you keep it moving horizontally through the upper canopy of the weeds. You weave it between the stalks just below the surface. This keeps the bait in the zone where light still penetrates, making it highly visible. The fish sitting lower in the shadows look up and see the clear silhouette of your bait swimming aggressively above them. It mimics a fleeing baitfish or a swimming craw, and it draws massive explosive strikes. If the bottom is hiding your lure, stop fishing the bottom. Move your presentation up into the light, where they can actually see it. There is a psychological barrier we all face on the water. We tie on our favorite jig, we fish it for 2 hours without a bite, and we become convinced that the fish are simply not there. We fire up the big motor and leave a perfectly good spot. But what if the fish were there the whole time? What if you were surrounded by giants, but your presentation was just totally wrong for the conditions? It is a hard pill to swallow, knowing you might have driven away from the best fishing of the day just because you refused to change your bait. You have to start questioning your assumptions. If you know a bay is warming up, if you see the new weed growth, the fish are there, period. If they are not biting your dark, heavy jig, do not leave. Change the weight, change the trailer, add a rattle, throw a neon color. Force yourself to experiment until you find the exact combination that breaks through their visual barriers. The anglers who catch the biggest bags are the ones who adapt to the environment, instead of forcing the environment to adapt to their favorite lure. The ultimate realization happens when you finally put it all together on the water. You find that thick patch of spring grass. But this time you do not just blindly throw your old standby. You tie on a lighter jig with a bulky high-action trailer. You pick a color that contrasts sharply with the green stalks. You add a small rattle for some acoustic presence. You pitch it silently, barely making a ripple, and let it flutter down slowly into a pocket. You do not rush it. You let it hang on a stem, and you just shake the rod tip gently. Suddenly, you do not just feel a bite, you feel a heavy, solid thump that resonates all the way down to the handle of your rod. You swing hard, the rod bows deeply, and a massive spring giant comes thrashing to the surface, wrapped in a pound of green weeds. In that moment, everything clicks. You realize that the fish were never gone, and the bite was never truly off. They just needed you to show them the bait in a way they could actually see it. That is the moment your entire approach to fishing heavy cover changes forever. So there it is. The uncomfortable truth is that we spend entirely too much time stubbornly throwing our favorite jigs into the weeds, completely unaware that they vanish into the shadows, bury themselves in the mud, or just blend in perfectly with the background. The turning point for your fishing success comes when you stop trusting tradition and start analyzing the underwater environment. It was never about the fish abandoning the shallow weeds. It was entirely about them not being able to see the trap you set. When you lighten your weight, increase your contrast, focus on the fall rate, and give them a reason to look, you will start pulling absolute giants out of cover you used to think was empty. This changes everything because it puts the control back in your hands. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out today. If this completely changed how you look at your tackle box, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. What is your absolute favorite spring jig color? And after watching this, Are you actually brave enough to change it up on your next trip? Let's talk about it down below.